Okay, this is our third ActionScript tutorial. We're going to keep going with our creating different types of games. We're actually going to create a game called Pong. So we have some things animating around. It's one of the first kind of arcade video games ever. And we're going to recreate it with a few extra details to it. So let's start as we usually do, creating a project actionScript3. And instead of just having a ball go back and forth, we're going to be a little bit more creative, and we're going to create a little Pac-Man type thing. So underneath our ellipse tool, if you hold it down, or our oval tool, there's an oval primitive tool. You're going to make sure you select that, and a Pac-Man is usually yellow. So let's select yellow in our properties before we do it. And the way it works with the primitive tool is you just draw your circle and you let go about this big, about like that. And then you can take your selection tool and grab the outside dot, and you can move, make kind of a mouth out of it. Something like that. Once you've got that created, we can start, we have to make it a symbol. So do hit F8. And we'll make it, let's call it Pac-Man. And it is a movie clip. And like usual, we'll give it an instance name, Pac-Man. And the Pac-Man opens and closes its mouth. So let's double click on the Pac-Man to get inside of that symbol. You can see now if I double click, I'm inside of the Pac-Man, and I've got a different timeline. And all we're going to do is on frame 5, make a keyframe. So F6. And then close the mouth at that point, like so, and have that last for 5 frames. So do another keyframe at frame 10, F6. So frame 1 it's open, and frame 5 it's closed. Okay. We can test this out by doing Control Enter to run it, and it should just open and close like that non-stop forever. Okay, and then we can go back by hitting the arrow in the top left, back to our regular scene. Okay. So our first step is we want this to be able to move across the screen. So with our Pac-Man selected, you can go into our code snippets. If you haven't brought or found that, or don't have it up right now, you hit your actions, F9 to bring this window up, and then hit the code snippets button to bring up your code snippets window. In our ActionScript folder, there is an animation folder, the top one, and we want to look for animate horizontally. So double click on animate horizontally, and again we've got some extra stuff that we don't need. We'll delete all that those comments at the beginning, and we can see it says pacman.x, the x coordinates. We're going to add 10 to it, and it's going to continuously do that. So as soon as we enter the frame that the ActionScript is on, which is frame 1, it will do this. Keep animating over and over and over, adding 10 to it. So if we run it, Control Enter, you can see it just takes off the screen and goes away forever. We can do the same thing with our Y. Let's say we wanted to go kind of diagonal. We can do pacman.y plus equals 10, and that will add 10 to its Y coordinate continually. So you can run that. You can see it goes down off the screen and goes out. So we want to be able to, when it hits the bottom, bounce off the bottom. When it hits the side, bounce off the side. And there's nothing that says we can bounce, but we can actually make it look like it's bouncing by, if it gets past, see the size of this window on the right hand side, we have the width is 550 and the height is 400. So if we get past 400, the Y value, we're going to just switch the direction of the Pac-Man. Same thing when we get past 550 on the width, we'll just switch the direction and keep bouncing the opposite way. So we can use some if statements. So if we pass this way, then we'll change direction. So how are we going to change direction? We're going to use, we have a speed of adding 10. Well, if we want to go the opposite direction, we have to subtract 10 from the x or the y, depending on which direction we're going. So to do that, we're going to use a variable, and a variable is just a it's a name for kind of a temporary holding for a number or a value that we can add to it or subtract to it. So we're going to make some values at the very top, some variables, and the way to create it is you do var for variable, and then the name, and we're going to call it the x speed, and set that to equal 0 at the beginning. So when we start a project, it's not going to, the Pac-Man just won't start automatically. It will only move when we click on a button, which we'll create in a second. So we got our x speed, and we'll have to also make one for y speed, and set those to equal to 0. So now we need to click on a button, like I said, to change this to go to a value like 10. So what we'll do, instead of adding 10 now, when we want to animate it, we're going to add the x speed and the y speed, which we'll set in a second. So we'll change this to x speed and change this to y speed. So as I work through it right now, if I were to run it, because our x speed and y speed are set to 0, it's going to be adding 0, so it won't actually move. That will change once we add our button. So what we should do right now is add our button. So just minimize this for a second. We need to add a button. So let's click on our, let's do our rectangle tool, and I'm just going to change the color to something else. Make it a pink, hot pink button. I'm going to create on my layer 1. Right now I'm on my actions layer, so I'm going to go to layer 1, and I'm going to add a button. This will be our start button. And you could put some text in there that says start if you want to, whatever you like. I'm just going to create it, make it a symbol, and I'll just call it start. And I'm going to leave it as a movie clip. If I wanted to, I could do it as a button and then have some states, like when you hover over it, it'll change and that kind of stuff, but we're not going to go into that. So just regular movie clip. Give it an instance name of start as well. And now we can go make sure it's highlighted like it is. And we're going to go into our code snippets. And because it is an action where we click on it, that is an event, just like we did with our the first assignment, the arrows. So this is a mouse click. When I click on it, something is going to happen. So I'll double click on that, and it'll create the code. We don't need all this comments here, and we don't need all the comments inside the brackets, all this stuff. Remember that anything that happens has to be in between the beginning and the closing brace bracket. So when we click, mouse click on the start button, it will do what's in these brackets. And what we want it to do is we want to set the speed that we set up here, set those to 10 or whatever speed we want the Pac-Man to move at. So we're going to go x speed equals 10 and y speed equals 10. So let's run that to make sure that all works. Control enter. When I click on this button, the Pac-Man should move, which it does. Yeah, so the next step will be to get it to bounce off the bottom and the sides and all the sides. So let's go to our actions. While we're animating here, so this is our button section, our start button. We want to go into the Pac-Man function here. After these, we're going to put in some if statements. So we'll do if with a bracket. So if your Pac-Man dot x, let's do the bottom first. So the top and bottom will be working with y. So if the y is greater than, and we said before that on the side here, our height is 400. So if the Pac-Man goes past 400, that means we've passed, we don't want to let it go past it. We want to change the direction. So now how this works is, let's move this down for a second. The Pac-Man, the location of the Pac-Man is based on this plus on the top left-hand corner. So if the Pac-Man is bouncing down here, we want it to bounce off the bottom of it, but the y value is right here. So to calculate where this is right now, you can show it just like this. 339 is the y value. Another way to do it would be to take the height of the stage and then subtract the height of the Pac-Man. But it can tell you right there is 339.95. So 339 will be good enough. So let's bring our actions back up here. So if it's greater than 339, close the brackets. Then what do we want it to do? It would be a beginning brace bracket. Hit enter and it'll fill in the closing one. We want it to change the y speed. We're going to put it to the opposite to change the direction. So y speed equals negative y speed. So that will just, in essence, change it to -10. Okay. Different than this, here we're doing plus equals, we're adding to its current value. Here we put the equal sign first, it equals negative y speed. That should make it bounce off the bottom. Let's test that out. So when you press this button, it should bounce off here. There we go. So that worked. Let's do the top. While we're at it, it'll be very much the same as this. If we copy this code, Control C, make sure we're still inside of these outside brace brackets, but we're after this one. We're going to paste it. If the Pac-Man, now at the top, we said is 0. Top left-hand quarter is 0, 0. So the y is 0. And the top of the Pac-Man, that plus, when it hits the top, it'll be 0. So we want it to go, instead of greater than, because we're working the opposite way, now we're less than. If it's less than 0, so if it goes past 0, then we'll set the y speed to negative y speed. If it's already currently a negative value, it's going to make two negatives will then make it a positive. That's the rule, right? So it'll change it to a going down instead of up. Let's go after this one again, and we might as well do the outside, the sides as well. So the difference now will be working with the x. So pacman.x. And let's do the same thing we did with the Pac-Man before. We'll move the Pac-Man to the right, so it's touching. What is the value of x? 490. We can put that back in the middle. Oops. So 490. So if it's greater than 490, yours might be slightly different. If it's greater than 490, then we're going to set the x speed, because now we're working with the x value, equals negative x speed. Let's copy that and put it below, and we'll do the top now, or sorry, the left-hand side. And same as how we did the y, we have to change this to a less than, because it's going to be on the left-hand side, it's 0. So if it's less than 0, then x speed will be negative x speed. So this should make it just bounce around if we did all the numbers correctly. Let's check it out. There we go, we're bouncing. Okay, and that will go on forever. So that gets us started. Now, the next step we want to do is to add a paddle or two paddles, whatever we want to do, and be able to go up and down and let it hit the paddle, try and hit the paddle as we go through it. So let's create the paddle. It's going to minimize this and make sure we're on layer 1, the first frame, and we're going to make a paddle with the rectangle tool, and let's make a different color. Black is fine. So let's make a paddle. Try not to make it super narrow like this, it'll create problems for our code. So this is better, just make it a little bit thicker. You can make it as big as you want or small as you want to make it challenging. We will select it, make it a symbol. I'm going to call it paddle 1, just in case you want to add another paddle. So paddle 1, give it an instance name of the same thing, paddle 1. And now we can again use our code snippets to create the code. Make sure it's selected, and this section is under animation. So open up the animation folder and move with keyboard arrows. We could have created this ourselves, this code, but it's quite a bit of code, and this does it for you. It's nice and easy that way. So double click on move and with keyboard arrows. Creates lots of code in here. And the key section that you'll have to know is for this paddle 1, this first section, that moving up and down here. You can see that if you press the up button, so if up pressed, it's going to go make the Y value go and subtract 5, and down, you'll add 5, and left and right, so on, with the X values. We can just test it out, Control Enter, and you should be able to use the arrow keys to move up and down. You can see that works. This also allows you to go side to side. If you want to keep that, you can. If you don't want to keep the original Pong would not allow you to move side to side, just up and down. So if you'd like, you can take away the right and left by just working with the code slightly. Just get rid of, in this first section here, get rid of the if left pressed and if right pressed. Just note that if you get rid of it, stop at the right bracket here. Don't go back past to this other one. That has to be there. Okay, we'll just delete that. So now if I run this, I can move up and down, but I cannot move left and right. We'll try to now, I think the original Pong game, when you go up, instead of having it disappear forever, it starts to show up on the bottom. So that's what we're going to do. When you go up, it'll show up at the bottom down here. And same thing if you go down, it'll pop up at the top. It'll scroll through, basically. So we go to our section in what we were just working with here, this first section. So if up pressed, it's going to move the Y value. That's fine. We'll go after that line, still inside this if statement, so inside these two brackets. And we'll say if paddle.y is less than 0, that's the top. Do your beginning brace bracket, hit enter. If this happens, then we want to set the Y value, paddle.y equals the bottom of the stage or the screen area is 400, so we'll set that to 400 with a semicolon at the end. Let's just test that to make sure that's all working good. Whoops, I made a mistake. Undefined property paddle. I called it paddle, and my instance name is actually paddle1. So I've got to do this here different. Paddle1.y for both of these. That'll solve that. Okay, so if I move up, it'll pop down. That didn't quite work as smooth as I'd like. So really what I want is not to just jump as soon as I hit the top. I want it to jump when the bottom of my paddle gets to the top. So I have to find the height of this paddle and subtract that value. So here's my paddle. If I click on it, I can see the size. The height is 87, so I've got to go negative 87 from where I was. Okay, so instead of less than 0, it's going to be less than negative 87. That was mine. So you'd have to see the height of your paddle, and then you can figure that number out. Let's try that again. If I go up, and it pops out the bottom. That's the look we want to have. So as it scrolls up, it comes to the bottom. Now we need to do the same action for the bottom when we're going down. So if down pressed, it's going to add a value to the Y, but we're also going to put the same kind of line. Oops. If paddle1.y is greater than 400, that's the bottom of our stage. So right, 400, beginning brace bracket, then paddle1.y equals 0. No, it'll equal negative 87, because it'll pop up above. So the opposite of this basically is what we're doing. Let's try that. Control Enter. If I go down, it should pop up to the top, which is what it does. I can go up and it'll pop down. That's kind of a neat feature. I have a couple more steps. We have to now make it so that the Pac-Man will bounce off of the paddle. So we can't do it quite like we did with the sides to make it look like it's bouncing. We have done something in the past where we've, if you think of the dress-up game when we dragged something onto something else, we used hit test object. So basically, if this hits this object, then we can do something. My alarm just went off. Sorry about that. I will quickly finish this and then we'll get it done. So here is our code. Go to our actions, and we have to go to our other section where we're working with our animating our Pac-Man. So we'll just add some more if statements after this section. So this is in our animate horizontal section. So if Pac-Man dot hit test object, and then you put in brackets what you're going to hit. So we're going to be, if it hits the paddle, which is paddle 1, note there are two regular brackets here. One closes this one, and the other one closes the beginning one. Okay, we do a beginning brace bracket and hit enter. So if the Pac-Man hits the paddle, what do we want to do? Well, we want to change our X speed. We just want it to go bouncing and go the opposite direction. So if it's coming at an angle, we don't need to change the Y value, it'll just keep going up, but we do have to change the X. So it'll be basically this line right here. We can copy it and paste it. Control V, Control C, copy, Control V to paste. Okay. And that should do it. Let's try that out. Control Enter, and we'll start it. And it bounces off. So that works good. What you might notice is that it can get stuck. If it goes behind your paddle, it'll start doing stuff like that. It messes it up. So we could reset our paddle so that it's a little bit closer to the wall and we don't get that action where it gets stuck. But we can work on that. So I would just move the paddle over and like this, and it shouldn't get stuck as easily. It might, if it's coming like this, it still might get caught in there if it hits kind of the topish area. And we could create code so it doesn't do that, but we're not going to worry about that. That's not the point of this tutorial. So we've got that. We're going to add one more little thing just to make it a little bit more interesting. Basically, every time it hits the Pac-Man, hits the paddle, we're going to increase the speed. So we can do that by going to our code. So every time it hits the paddle, we change direction, but we're also going to add to the speed. So the X speed plus equals 1. We're going to add 1 to the X value of it, and we would add also to our Y value. Y speed plus equals 1. So let's try that out. Control Enter. So we should see eventually every time it hits the paddle, it's going to go a little faster and a little faster. I think it is doing that. Looks like it's going a little bit faster. Yep, it's definitely going faster. Okay, especially when it gets caught like that, that's going to be hard. Okay, so you get the idea, and that's all we'll do for today. There'll be a part 2 coming up next for our next tutorial. To finish it off, we're going to add some sound when it hits, and we'll also keep track of some points. If we miss, we'll subtract points. If we hit it, we'll add points, things like that.